Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of people out there really want to get better at, and that's really mastering spoken English.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you can understand a lot of English, but actually speaking it fluently, it feels like you're always on the outside looking in.
Yeah. And, I think it's becoming more and more vital these days, whether you're thinking about your job, wanting to travel the world more confidently, or just, connecting with people on a deeper level. And it's something that we hear a lot. People say, this is really tough. This is a hard climb. This is something I struggle with.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really what we're hoping to do in this deep dive is to pull out some of the best strategies for actually improving your spoken English. And we've got a great source for this one, a really in-depth YouTube podcast that really gets into the practical advice here. We're not talking about just memorizing a bunch of grammar rules.
Right.
It's really about what are the actual steps you can take to become more confident and fluent.
Yeah. And I think if we kind of go through these ideas, it's good for you as the listener to be thinking about, what your goals are, because whether you're trying to crush it at job interviews or, navigate a city in a foreign country, or just have better conversations with colleagues or friends in English, I think the ideas that we're going to go through can apply no matter, what your specific goal is.
Yeah, totally. And so the first thing we want to unpack is, why does it feel so hard? Why is it so difficult to actually speak fluently?
Yeah.
Our source gets into some of the reasons, and I think these will probably resonate with a lot of people out there.
Yeah. And what I find really fascinating is that, this feeling of, I'm really struggling here is pretty much universal. And the script kind of points to a few key factors.
Right.
First off, there's this huge fear of making mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and that can totally paralyze you.
Oh, yeah.
People are so scared of sounding silly or getting it wrong
Yeah.
that they just clam up. They just don't even want to talk.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like you know what you want to say in your head,
Right.
but it's that connection to actually getting it out of your mouth that just like breaks down.
Absolutely.
And then there's the fact that a lot of people just don't have a ton of opportunities to practice.
Right.
Maybe you're studying vocabulary. Maybe you're, doing grammar exercises.
Yeah.
But actually putting it all together in a real conversation is just a totally different ballgame.
It is. And, a third point that the script brings up is that people get so caught up in the grammar rules when they're trying to talk
Oh, yeah.
that, they're trying to remember what's the perfect tense here? What's the preposition I need to use?
Yeah,
And it just completely blocks the flow of the conversation.
totally. Yeah, it's like if you were trying to do a dance and like analyze every single muscle movement at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It would be impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. You wouldn't be able to actually do it. You'd be so up in your head.
Yeah.
So those are three really big ones, I think. Fear, lack of practice, and then overthinking the rules. And so what's nice is that the source says, hey, these are totally normal.
Yeah.
These are things that, everyone deals with. And more importantly, there are ways to address them.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to the meat of our deep dive here, which is 5 key steps to actually improve
Yeah.
your spoken English. So number 1 is listen actively. And this might sound a little counterintuitive because we're talking about speaking here, but It really is the foundation.
Yeah. And it actually makes a lot of sense. If you think about how we learn any language, usually you go through a period where you understand more than you can produce.
Yeah.
So listening comes first.
Oh.
So the more you listen to English, the more you immerse yourself in the sounds and the rhythms,
Yeah,
the better you're going to be able to reproduce them yourself.
absolutely.
And the script, recommends listening to TED Talks, podcasts like this one,
Right.
getting as much input as possible.
Yeah. And it's not just about understanding the words themselves.
Right.
It's about picking up on the flow of the speech.
Yeah.
The rhythm, the intonation, how native speakers actually say things.
Exactly. The things that a textbook can't really teach you.
Right. And one specific technique they mention is called shadowing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is really cool.
I love shadow.
So basically, you listen to a sentence or a short passage, and then you repeat it right after trying to copy everything.
Yeah, like their pronunciation, their intonation, even their pauses.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like training your brain and your mouth to make those movements.
Right, like muscle memory.
Exactly.
The English pronunciation specifically.
Yeah, like a musician practicing scales.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so step number 2 is start small.
Okay.
And this is really good news, I think, for anyone who feels overwhelmed by the idea of like jumping into a complex conversation.
Yeah.
The script says, don't try to run a marathon before you can walk.
Right.
Just start with simple things like describing your daily routine out loud. So, you could say, I'm making a cup of coffee. I'm checking the news on my phone.
Yeah. And it might feel a little weird at first,
Yeah.
but it's a really low pressure way to get used to forming those sentences.
Totally. Yeah. And I really like the suggestion of like even just asking yourself questions
Oh, yeah.
and answering them in English. So like, you could say, what am I going to do this afternoon?
Right.
And then answer that in English. It's a good way to practice, making sentences and just getting comfortable with it.
Yeah. And you can do it all by yourself.
Yeah.
Nobody has to hear you.
Exactly.
And the emphasis here on consistency over intensity, I think, is so key.
Yeah.
It's much better to do a little bit every day
Yeah.
than to try and cram in, hours of speaking practice all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So number 3, this one is so important.
Okay.
Focus on fluency, not perfection.
Yes.
We talked about the fear of making mistakes.
Right.
And that can be so paralyzing. And so the script really emphasizes it's okay to make mistakes, especially when you're starting out. Your goal is to communicate your message. It's not to be grammatically perfect.
Right. And actually focusing on getting your message across
Yeah.
gives you more opportunity for feedback.
Right.
Because the person listening to you will let you know whether they understand you or not.
Right. And it makes so much sense, Think about little kids when they're learning to talk.
Yeah.
They don't start out with perfect grammar.
Absolutely not.
They just start putting words together.
Right. They use broken sentences, as the script says, but they get their point across.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't get discouraged.
And they keep trying. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's that spirit that we want to cultivate here.
Exactly.
All right, step 4, expand your useful vocabulary.
Okay.
I like how they emphasize useful here.
Yeah, because it's not about just memorizing the dictionary.
Right, exactly.
It's about learning the words and phrases that you're actually going to use.
Yeah. And they recommend learning phrases in context rather than just isolated words.
Right, because that way you see how the word is actually used in a sentence.
Yeah.
And how it fits grammatically.
Yeah, they give a great example of, learning the word however by practicing the sentence, I'd love to go, however, I'm busy.
Exactly.
So you're not just learning the word however, you're learning how to actually use it in a sentence.
Exactly.
And then they also recommend using apps like Anki or Quizlet for vocabulary practice, which is really helpful.
Spaced repetition is great.
Yeah, it helps you remember things long term.
Yeah.
All right, so now we get to step 5, which for a lot of people I think can feel like the most daunting, also the most important. Practice with real humans.
Yeah, you got to do it.
So the script recommends things like language exchange apps like Tandem or HelloTalk.
Right. So those are apps where you can connect with someone who's learning your language.
Yeah.
And you can help each other out.
Yeah.
And, practice speaking together.
Exactly. And then they also mention, if you can find local meetups or where you can practice with people in person, that's obviously ideal.
Yeah, for sure.
But even if you can't find those partners right away,
All right.
there's still things you can do like practicing in the mirror.
Yeah.
Or recording yourself speaking.
That could be helpful.
Yeah, it feels a little weird at first, but it gets you used to hearing your own voice.
Yeah, and it can help you identify areas where you might be hesitating.
Yeah, or stumbling over words.
Exactly.
And they say the ultimate goal here is to train yourself to think in English.
Yes.
So you're not constantly translating in your head.
Right, because when you can get to that point where you're just thinking directly in English, that's when you're really going to see a huge jump in your fluency.
Yeah, it's like learning to swim.
Yep.
At first you're thinking about every movement, but then eventually it just becomes automatic.
Right. Your body just knows what to do.
Okay, so we've talked about the 5 steps. Now, our source also gets into some common mistakes that learners often make.
Yeah.
And being aware of these can be really helpful.
Definitely, because if you can recognize these pitfalls, then you can start to avoid them.
Right, exactly. So the first one I mentioned is translating directly from your native language.
Right.
And as we talked about earlier, that can really slow you down, and it often just doesn't sound natural.
Yeah, it can sound a little clunky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the solution is to really try to think in English as much as possible.
Exactly.
Which is tough, but that's the goal.
Yeah, you've got to build that direct connection between the thought and the English words.
Yeah, exactly. Another common mistake is speaking too fast.
Oh, yeah?
I think sometimes people think if they speak really quickly, that sounds more fluent,
Right.
but it's actually not true at all.
It's much better to be clear than to be fast.
Yeah. Especially when you're still learning,
Yeah,
It's better to take your time and pronounce things clearly.
exactly.
And then the last one I mentioned is avoiding difficult sounds,
Yeah.
like the "fee" sound.
The classic fee.
It's tempting to just skip over those or substitute easier sounds, but that's not going to help you in the long run.
Right, you got to face those sounds head on.
Yeah, and they have a fun suggestion for this: practice tongue twisters.
Oh, yeah?
So they give the example of 33 thirsty thinkers thought thoughtfully.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about strategies, we've talked about pitfalls. Now there's one more really crucial element that our source material highlights,
Okay.
and that's confidence.
Yes.
You can have all the grammar and vocabulary in the world, but if you don't have the confidence to actually speak, it's not going to do you much good.
It's like the fuel. It makes everything else work.
Yeah, exactly. And they suggest this really interesting technique called power posing.
Oh, yeah.
So before you know you need to speak English,
Yeah.
you're actually stand in a confident posture for like 2 minutes.
Like a superhero pose.
Yeah, exactly. And it might sound a little silly,
It does.
but they say it can actually help you feel more confident.
Yeah. And there's some research that suggests it might have some physiological effects too. Maybe it changes your hormone levels a little bit.
Yeah.
But even if it's just a psychological thing,
Yeah.
just standing tall and taking up space,
Yeah.
I think can make you feel more confident.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing they recommend is celebrating small victories.
Oh, yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the mistakes and feel discouraged.
Yeah.
If you can really celebrate those little wins, like, ordering food successfully or understanding something someone said in a conversation,
Uh-huh.
that can really boost your motivation and your confidence.
It shifts your focus to what you are able to do
Exactly.
instead of what you're not able to do yet.
Yeah. And then the last thing they mentioned in this section is so important.
Okay.
Remember that even native English speakers make mistakes.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Language is messy.
Yeah.
And everyone stumbles over words sometimes.
Yeah. Nobody's perfect.
And so it's not about being perfect. It's about just being able to communicate.
Exactly.
All right. So let's wrap things up here.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into mastering spoken English.
We have.
So let's just recap the main takeaways from our source material.
All right. So we started off talking about active listening,
Yeah.
how important it is to train your ear to hear the sounds and the rhythms of English.
Yeah.
And then we talked about the importance of daily practice,
Right.
starting small,
Yeah.
even if it's just describing what you're doing out loud.
Yeah.
And then that crucial mindset shift from focusing on perfect grammar to focusing on fluency.
Right. Communication over perfection.
Yeah, exactly. And we talked about practical ways to expand your vocabulary by learning phrases in context.
Yeah.
And then finally, that big one, practice with real humans as much as you can.
Yeah. Get out there and talk to people.
And remember to celebrate your progress along the way.
Yes.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah. So no matter what your goals are, whether it's, succeeding in job interviews, having amazing travel experiences, or just feeling more comfortable in conversations,
Right.
your journey to better spoken English really starts by embracing these strategies.
And I think that brings us to a really important question for you, the listener. Out of all the strategies that we talked about today, which one stands out to you the most?
Yeah.
And more importantly, what's one small step that you can take today to start implementing that strategy into your daily life?
Yeah, because that's how you're actually going to see progress.
Exactly. Even just one small change can make a big difference over time.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe it'll lead to some pretty big wins in your English speaking journey.
I think so.
All right, that's it for this deep dive into mastering spoken English. We'll see you next time.
See you later.